Rape and sexual violence has been an integral part of warfare for as long as we have existed. And in war, when the restraints of respect for another human's integrity are pretty much already gone, the step from killing the enemy to living out your lust through rape becomes much shorter. Records of the desire to inhibit as well as the willingness to use rape as a weapon of conquest go back beyond the writing of the Torah. World War II is no different, and even if some belligerents try to rein it in, we should have no illusions. The denigrating invasion of what makes us most vulnerable, our sexuality and need for intimacy, is a part of this war on all sides. And while the vast majority of victims are women, men too fall victim to sexual violence and rape. Furthermore, among the Western allies, any prosecution of perpetrators is plagued with racism and ideas of racially motivated inferior morals usually associated with the Axis opponents. They in turn use racialist mythology as an excuse to dehumanize millions of women, making them permissible targets for forced prostitution, violent rape, and sexual murder. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. Rape. A crime that brings feelings of shame to both victim and perpetrator. A crime that is mostly perpetrated against women by male perpetrators aided and abetted by a culture of gender inequality. A crime that is often never reported because of those feelings of shame and stigma associated with sex in general. A private crime, where often the only proof is the word of the victim, so that the rare cases where it is prosecuted, the victim is often victimized again by not being believed, or even worse, being blamed for the crime. A vicious crime that scars the souls of the victims for years, sometimes for life, and destroys our sacred right to decide over our own bodies and sexuality. An invasion of the body of a woman that risks violating both her and her offspring if she becomes pregnant. A crime that is incredibly hard to research, especially for a time when the deck is even more stacked against the victims than today. Be that as it may, to not speak of it is both ignoring a big part of this war and a continuation of the systematic taboo that perpetuates the suffering of anyone who has been victim of such crimes. And we have covered the issues of sexual violence on this channel already. In Asia, we've seen the Japanese unleash brutal and frenzied campaigns of rape in the aftermath of battles in China, the Philippines, and elsewhere, as well as the systematic enslavement of Korean and other women as so-called comfort women. Their opponents, the Chinese Nationalist Army, have also raped and pillaged their own peasantry during the fighting, most recently while retreating through Henan province in the face of Japan's Operation Ichigo. I've spoken of the plunder, abuse, and rape committed by partisan units in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. Anna has talked about the exploitation of the Nazi breeding program or Lebensborn system on the home front. I've covered the German sexual exploitation within the Nazi slave system and the Holocaust. Today, as vast armies move across Europe and huge swaths of territory change hands in 1944, I will examine how this brings new patterns of sexual violence to the fragile towns, cities, and countrysides of Europe. I'll start with the Western Allies, for whom there are two waves of rape that occur in the summer of 1944. The first is in Italy and centers on the Moroccan Goumiers of the French Expeditionary Force. The Goumiers are irregular troops who have earned a reputation for being effective fighters in the mountains of Tunisia and on Sicily. The first Goumiers arrive on mainland Italy in November 1943. More soldiers follow, and by April 1944, there are 3 regimental-sized units known as Groupe de Tabour Marocain deployed in Italy. These count about 11,000 Goumiers and 1,100 French officers. The Goumiers proved to be effective soldiers in the mountainous regions as the Allies push on the Gustav Line and drive on Rome. But soon, Not only the German enemy feels their wrath, but so do Italian civilians in the Lazio region. Already in January 44, reports emerged of rape, violence, looting, and even murder against Italian civilians. This violence escalates in May and June as the Moroccan troops clear the enemy from the Aronci Mountains between the river Gargliano and Rome. By the end of the Allied occupation, the Italian authorities will have recorded 1,157 rapes by Allied troops, with almost 90% of those attributed to what the Italians call French colored troops. The actual number of rapes is certainly much, much higher. We know that women are unlikely to report rape and sexual violence, and men and children even less so. These events will be remembered as the Moroccanate, or Moroccan deeds. In post-war Italy and beyond, it will be viewed through a racial lens, with Moroccans painted as inherently sexually violent. But a racial explanation doesn't quite hold up to scrutiny. Leaving aside that race is an arbitrary social construct, the argument falls apart when we look at other French colonial units. Other French expeditionary units made up of Algerians, Berbers, Senegalese, and notably the 2nd Moroccan Infantry Division and the 4th Moroccan Mountain Division are not subject to the same accusations of mass rape and out-of-control violence. So, what sets the Goumiers apart? Well, two things really. Their location and their commander's attitude. They do much of their fighting in the remote mountain regions. The Allied Control Commission and the Italian authorities have little presence here, leaving the population open for exploitation. Even when authorities are present, they have little power. The most that Italian police can do is arrest a soldier and hand him over to the French army. The most that the Allied Control Commission can do is collect reports and put pressure on General Alphonse Juin, commander of the French Expeditionary Corps. And therein lies the main problem. The French army has a very relaxed attitude to the Goumiers. Compared to other more regular units, including other colonial units of the FEC, the Goumiers have a far lower proportion of officers and NCOs assigned to them. The French officers who are present have a uniquely close relationship with their men. This provides an efficient and fiercely loyal fighting force, but the price that the French pay for this extraordinary fighting force is in part to turn a blind eye to criminal behavior. This attitude goes as high as General Juin himself. In May, when the Allied Control Commission presses Juin to act, he promises decisive action, writing in a memo the 27th that the culprits will be punished without mercy. But even after these strong words, the rapes reach their highest level in June and continue into July. Already in the memo, Juin deflects. Enemy propaganda doubtlessly has made capital of these acts, which in many cases are unfortunately true, in order to exaggerate and throw discredit on us. However, by July, Juin caves in to continued pressure and takes some action. Courts-martial hand out life imprisonment and death sentences, and as a consequence, some 102 French fighters are executed for rape and plunder. 15 are Moroccans executed in the field. Another 54 Goumiers are sentenced to prison for terms of 5 years to life for crimes of murder, attempted murder, rape, and looting. But even these harsh deterrents don't end the violence altogether, and it is only when the French start withdrawing the Goumiers from Italy in August that the wave of violence subsides. This pattern, that the Goumiers' violent behavior really only begins when they are outside of control and supervision, is repeated in Western Europe. Now, this second wave of rapes in 1944 is largely driven by American forces in Normandy, but I should be clear that the cases of rape are reported by all nationalities fighting in Western Europe for the United Nations alliance. It just happens that the US soldiers are more numerous in Normandy, and as we shall see, in some cases uniquely positioned to commit these crimes. In any case, by May 1944, the number of American servicemen in Britain is over 1.5 million, but the incidence of rape is about the same as during peacetime for the same population size. By the end of the war, 121 American soldiers will have been convicted of rape in Britain. Again, that number is undoubtedly much, much lower than the true count of rapes. Post-war research will estimate the figure of rapes committed by U.S. troops in the Allied Expeditionary Force invading France as at least 14,000, probably more. The majority of those happened in France and Germany, but the true number in Britain is definitely higher than 121. Moreover, the types of rape committed in Britain are different. Unlike the rape and pillage, sadistic, random violence we saw in Italy, most cases of rape that go to U.S. military courts in Britain are similar to civilian cases of rape where, in most instances, alleged perpetrator and victim are acquainted on some level. Of the 121 soldiers convicted of rape at U.S. Army court-martials in Britain during the war, 41 are black. This is a huge overrepresentation given that black soldiers make up less than 1/10 of American forces in Britain. Again, I should point out that the conviction rate is only a fraction of the probable real cases and a small portion of reported rape cases. Moreover, a colored suspect is more likely to be convicted, as the usual tendency to dismiss the victim's testimony is somewhat lower. Much like back in America, when the alleged perpetrator is colored, the courts-martial place far greater weight on the word of a white British woman than a black American soldier. The incidence of rape increases when the men go into the field, and the racist slant does not go away. Now, on the front lines in Western Europe, cases of battlefield rape committed by Western Allied forces do happen, but are comparatively low. It is in the rear, in newly liberated areas, where most rapes occur. It is estimated that between June 1944 and the end of the war, there are at least 3,500 rapes committed by American servicemen in France, probably more. A large part of them comes in a wave of rapes across Normandy in the summer of 1944. Just as in Italy, this becomes a highly racialized issue. In October 1944, the U.S. Chief of Police in the European Theater of Operations reports that 152 American soldiers have been tried for rape. He points out that despite making up just 10% of the Army's strength in France, 139 of these soldiers are listed as colored. Now, we should be careful to take those percentages as representative for the remaining 3,361 or more estimated rapes. So, how does this overrepresentation arise? First of all, segregation. On the whole, most black soldiers are denied combat roles. Instead, they are overrepresented in the service forces where, in some units, the black strength is as high as 33%. That doesn't lead to a higher rate of rape, per se, but these stationary forces are more likely to be identified by a victim. Simply put, whereas an infantryman could rape a woman in a liberated village and move on shortly thereafter, black soldiers are stationed in fixed bases, have no means of escape, and are more likely to be investigated and prosecuted. The black soldiers are also more likely to be convicted. According to records of French police and the U.S. Army, most of the rapes take place at night, and many accusers admit that they would be unable to identify their rapist in any way. Despite this, it is often assumed that the attacker is black. In response, the Army simply rounds up entire groups of black soldiers from nearby units for identity parades. In other cases, black soldiers will be arrested and charged with rape simply on account of being in the local area with no other evidence. The same dynamics as in Great Britain come into play again. It seems that the courts tend to assume that no white woman would willingly choose to have sex with a black man. By contrast, when a white soldier is accused, the women are more often brushed off as scorned lovers, temptresses, or even prostitutes. Sentencing is also harsher for black soldiers. In the years 1944 and 45, 25 of the 29 people executed for rape in the European Theater of Operations are black. In France, some of these soldiers are hanged in public executions to send a message to other black soldiers and the local community, further stigmatizing rape as a black crime. These proceedings are publicized in the press in Normandy, but are censored in the U.S. press because the Army fears a backlash from American civil rights groups like the NAACP. One case in Great Britain is telling of how race plays a part in convictions and how the public reacts when they hear of it. On May 25th, 1944, a black American soldier is convicted of raping a British woman at knife point near the city of Bath in southern England. The soldier is sentenced to death, with the case hinging on a signed confession. From May and into June, the British paper The Daily Mirror publishes pieces appealing for clemency for the soldier. It argues that the evidence against him is flawed and would have resulted in an acquittal in an English court. On June 9th, the Tribune newspaper publishes the soldier's claim that he had been forced to sign the confession. By then, over 30,000 locals have signed a petition against the sentence. Eventually, on June 17th, the Assistant Staff Judge Advocate Captain Frederick J. Bertolet strikes down the guilty verdict. Bertolet upholds the GI's claim that he signed his confession only after being held for many hours without food and under intimidation by a captain. Bertolet's decision is upheld by General Eisenhower himself. Now, while American commanders see things through a racial lens and French commanders turn a blind eye to rape in Italy, the Germans and Soviet armies both encourage the use of rape as a weapon of war. This is especially true for the SS, security police, and Wehrmacht units assigned to fight the Bandenbekämpfung, or the anti-partisan war. Most notorious is Oskar Dirlewanger and his brigade of sadistic criminals. They rampage across Poland and Belarus, torturing, raping, and burning villages. In recent episodes of War Against Humanity, I've also talked about the use of rape and the brutal suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. But for the vast majority of troops, sexual crimes are never sanctioned like this, and the situation in the West and the East is very different. Sexual offenses during the occupation of France or the Netherlands are categorized and punished as rape or moral offenses. Again, the real numbers are hugely underreported, and reported cases are often brushed off as boys will be boys or the girl asked for it. But the willingness to at least deal with it to some degree is indicated by cases like the 10 men sentenced to death and 79 imprisoned for moral offenses from the 12th Infantry Division during the occupation of France. In contrast, in the East, prosecution is more or less unheard of, and SS troops are even awarded medals for their brutality, including systematic rape. The Slavs and Jews are considered a permissible target for pretty much anything. That said, early in the occupation of Poland, even as German forces executed Polish intellectuals and ghettoized the Jews, the authorities did punish some rapists. But usually only if the crime had been committed in a public place and threatened to damage the Wehrmacht's reputation. Like in 1941 in the village of Pniewo, when 2 German soldiers were sentenced to death for raping a Polish woman in public. Notably, 50 Poles had gathered at the scene and a German policeman had arrested the men in the act. But most crimes are either never reported or dismissed because of German belief in Slavic inferiority. Moreover, many thousands of women of the perceived inferior races are forced into prostitution in the Wehrmacht brothels behind the front lines and in the SS brothels in the concentration camps. Things are the worst in the occupied Soviet Union, though. Villagers in the Cherkasy region in occupied Ukraine will recall long after the war that rape became a routine part of German occupation. During the initial invasion, this often took the form of German soldiers breaking into houses or abducting their victims, gang-raping women and girls, and in some cases killing them. As the occupation settled in, these sort of crimes continued, but by then, the Germans often conscripted the local starosta, or village head, or their local ethnicity auxiliaries, to find local women and girls to be rounded up and raped. As the Germans withdrew from Ukraine earlier this year, things became even worse, as one villager will remember. As our army was already advancing, there were battles right close, and the Germans were still here. At that time, it was better to not be caught. They became cruel, even more cruel, with their power and killing and everything, and rape. In the rare case that a soldier is punished for rape, it is not because of any moral offense against the women. Rather, he is punished for breaking with Nazi ideology. In the ghettos and concentration camps where the Wehrmacht and SS personnel systematically rape women and girls, even fewer of these cases make it into the official records. When they do, it is because the men have been charged with Rassenschande, or the crime of shaming the race. Yet, this is no effective deterrent, and crimes will continue throughout the war. In the camps and the Gestapo prisons, sexual violence and rape is also used systematically as torture and punishment of both women and men. As 1944 passes into 1945, rape as collective punishment will soon become a legacy of the Soviet forces when they will resume their march westward. But while fighting and stationed in Soviet territory itself, the commanders of the Red Army have kept their forces on a relatively short leash. So while there have been cases of brutal sexual violence inflicted on people in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, this has not yet reached the endemic level that the Red Army will become notorious for when it enters Hungarian and German territory in 1945. However, already now the seed of this problem is already sown within the ranks of the Red Army. Unlike most other fighting forces, women serve alongside men. Of course, there are many consensual relationships between female soldiers and their male comrades or officers, but rape is fairly commonplace. Beyond outright violent assault, many officers pressure women into becoming field wives. Sometimes accepting these advances is the only way for a woman to secure protection from predatory junior soldiers. Female Red Army soldiers taken prisoner and freed from German camps find themselves under attack by their supposed liberators. Civilians find themselves in a similar position. In Ukraine, sexual violence is fiercest against women who worked for the Germans, either voluntarily or as forced laborers. The writer Vasily Grossman notes simply that Soviet girls liberated from the camps are suffering a lot now. The experience is similar in Poland. Women freed from working for the Germans now working for the Soviets become vulnerable to attack from them instead. The rates of sexual violence also increase now that the Red Army is on foreign soil. Many Soviet officers are stationed in the homes of the Poles where they have easy access to women and girls. Attacks become more brazen, including public rapes in front of people going about their everyday business. By the end of the war, it will be estimated that at least 40,000 Polish women will have been raped by the Red Army. On the whole, it would be wrong to say that the Red Army Command actively encourages rapes, at least now in 1944. But it certainly has a fairly relaxed attitude towards it and puts in place relatively few measures against rape. Soviet de facto dictator Joseph Stalin himself sees it as a natural consequence of the battle against Nazi Germany. In northeastern Yugoslavia, there is a spate of Red Army rapes in 1944. By the end of the year, over 1,200 rapes, including more than 100 with attempted murder, will have been reported. When Milovan Dilas, part of the Yugoslav partisan military mission to the Soviet Union, complains to Stalin, the Soviet dictator gives the following response. Imagine a man who has fought from Stalingrad to Belgrade, over thousands of kilometers of his own devastated land, across the dead bodies of his comrades and dearest ones. How can such a man react normally? And what is so awful in his having a bit of fun with a woman after such horrors? The Red Army is not ideal. The important thing is that it fights Germans, and it fights them well, while the rest doesn't matter. If Allied women are essentially collateral damage, then enemy women are little more than targets. Already we've seen how the complex friend-foe view towards Poles has resulted in increased brutality by the Red Army in Poland. On top of that, ethnic German women in Poland have suffered more under the occupation. On October 21st, when the Red Army will make a brief border incursion into German territory at Nemersdorf in East Prussia, the German government will accuse the Red Army of having murdered German adults and children and French and Belgian POWs, and of having raped over 60 women and girls. Reichspropaganda-Minister Joseph Goebbels will seize on Nemersdorf for a propaganda campaign to strike fear in German hearts and convince his people to fight to the death. And it's likely that the incident has been at least somewhat exaggerated, but it provides a foretaste of what is to come in cities like Budapest and eventually Berlin next year. I will return to that as it happens in our timeline. The victims will return to these crimes for the rest of their lives. Because, think about it, we all remember the first time we had sex. We have sexual memories about intimate moments, feelings of lust, infatuation, and love, and about especially exciting sexual adventures we may have experienced. We even fantasize regularly about sex we haven't had. These memories, these fantasies, define our sexual identity. They forge our innermost ability to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and give ourselves wholeheartedly to another human being. Now imagine that one of those memories is fear of death at the hands of a sweaty stranger who strips away all of your armor, handles you as a piece of meat, and enters your body without the slightest care for your feelings or even who you are. Imagine the absolute terror of being forced into vulnerability against your will, suffering pain and degradation that leaves irreparable wounds to both your body and soul. Imagine if that is the memory that guides your sexuality, your ability to love, your ability to form intimate relationships. Rape is a crime that destroys the very humanity that defines our most beautiful ability to trust, love, and be loved. Never forget.